What will be the result of President Biden's Supreme Court reform plan? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. Joining me is Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel for, well, I guess I've known for, 30-something years, Richard? Good to see you again.
To see you, to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yep, thanks for tuning in. So, Richard, we have an event this past few days that reminds me of Franklin Roosevelt, and that's Joe Biden's court reform plan, his reform plan for the Supreme Court. Now, every lame duck president must go through a very traumatic experience when everybody realizes that he is no longer going to be president. I mean, he doesn't get his phone calls returned anymore, and people start treating him like he were nothing. I mean, I've read that in the White House, even the hired help do not respond as readily as they did when the guy might have a chance to get reelected. So I'm sure he's going through a very emotionally difficult time now that he's announced that he's no longer going to run. So to maintain some kind of relevance, I think he's doing anything he can. And Biden comes up with this plan to reform the Supreme Court. Well, it immediately brought to my mind Franklin Roosevelt, and that was Roosevelt's infamous courts packing scheme. We've talked about the New Deal, Richard, and the things that Roosevelt was doing with his combination socialism and fascism. But when the Supreme Court was declaring much of his New Deal in violation of the Constitution, and rightly so. I mean, socialism and fascism were not exactly the types of things that the framers were establishing with the Constitution. Roosevelt went ballistic, and he felt like he knew what was necessary to save America from the Great Depression. And so he comes up with this plan to pack the Supreme Court with his cronies that would give him a majority that would then start sustaining his socialist and fascist programs. And it was a plan where he was going to replace every justice. No, for every justice that was 70 years or more, he would add on another justice. And he claimed that this would relieve them of their workload. Well, it was a sham. It was just a way to pack the court with statist lawyers, lawyers that believe in socialism and economic fascism. And despite his tremendous popularity, the American people went up in arms and said, no, you're not going to tamper with our federal judicial system. No matter how much you want to get your socialism and fascism in, and they were supporting him on it. He was getting his programs enacted through Congress, which of course represents the American people. But the overwhelming sentiment in both Congress and the American populace and the mainstream press was, no, you're not going to tamper with the judicial system as a way to circumvent the court. And so it went down to defeat. Now, Roosevelt ends up prevailing anyway as a practical matter, but I'm not really sure that you can argue that that's why Biden is trying to reform the court. I think, his plan calls for term limits, which if were to be enacted, I think 3 justices would automatically be evicted from the court. And I think there are justices that he would not be disappointed to see leave. But my hunch, Richard, is that this thing's going to go nowhere. Not only because he's a lame duck, but because of that same sentiment. You want an independent judiciary. I'd be the last one to defend a lot of the things the court has done, but I think the idea of an independent judiciary is essential to our governmental system of a limited government republic. And notwithstanding the fact that they let the national security state do whatever it wants, I don't think this thing's going anywhere. What do you think?
Well, let me just sort of highlight your first comments about Franklin Roosevelt. he became so angry that in some press conference, he referred to the justices of the Supreme Court when they were knocking down the New Deal programs. Those old 9 men who want to keep America in the horse and buggy era, backward looking rather than forward looking. Well, there was a Washington journalist named David Lawrence who went on later to found U.S. News and World Report. And he wrote a book called 9 Wise Men, saying they were wise men because they valued the long-run institutional importance of the Constitution and its conception of government than pandering to the seemingly emergencies and the conveniences of the moment. 9 wise men. Now, about Biden, yeah, first of all, his mindset. I don't know, remember if it was in the interview with Stephanopoulos or one that he had shortly after that, following the debate debacle, in which he told the reporter, you can read it online, the arrogance of the man, the hubris of the man. Under my presidency, I am ruling the world. I'm solving all the problems of the world. I am bringing peace to the Middle East. I have been fighting. I have kept Russia at bay by supporting Ukraine. I'm doing my power to end climate change. I. This arrogance of being a social engineer and a central planner, not just for the country, but for the world, is very FDR-like. When Roosevelt came back from the Yalta Conference, after having met with Stalin and Churchill, dividing up the post-World War world, he came back and said in his address, I worked with Stalin to decide this. I determined, I worked out, I'm establishing. This egoism, this perverse egoism of believing that you are wise enough, intelligent enough, informed enough, dispassionate enough above the mere mindsets of the ordinary person to be the master of the world. And so now he is upset that the Supreme Court has made certain decisions. And now, in the face of this, he believes that if I and those who think like me don't get our way, then we just change the institutional structure of the court to make sure the court votes and establishes precedents that we like. Now, there have been other Supreme Court members and periods that have been the other way around. Quote, in the modern American sense, liberal courts, the Earl Warren Court. And there were conservatives and some classical liberals who were very upset with the decisions of the Warren Court. Now, there was an impeach Earl Warren movement, but to my knowledge, never, and maybe viewers and listeners will correct me, but I can't remember ever Republicans or conservatives saying, nope, we have to change the structure of the Supreme Court. We have to throw those rascals out and have these term limits to reappoint them the way we want. Whether you like it or not, there is institutional reasons why the founding fathers established the 3 branches of government and why they structured the Senate and the House and the presidency in terms of their staggered terms of office, some shorter, some longer, for the division of powers and the lack of a concentration of too much authority in one place, and for there to be those checks and balances. And that is what the court is supposed to do. It is supposed to represent a 3rd branch of government that evaluates what the Congress passes and what the president may do to determine whether they are consistent with or not with the principles and concepts and requirements and limits of the Constitution. And to basically say, I've decided that I don't like some recent decisions of the Supreme Court, so I want to rotate the people out who I don't like to appoint the people I do like. First of all, it undermines the very structure of the U.S. constitutional system, but is a two-edged sword. I would ask Biden's progressive members, okay, so you rotate people in that you like and give court decisions that you're more comfortable with or like to see. So what happens if now another president comes in and there's another Congress giving consent to nominees to go to the court, rotated out in the staggered fashion. And now they load the court again and they give decisions that you don't like. This is a two-edged sword. You can't always assume that the people you want are in office. What I sometimes tell my students, Jacob, is imagine the politician who you hate the most and trust the least, right? Imagine in your mind the politician who you hate the most and trust the least. Would you want him to have all of this concentrated executive authority? Well, do you want to give a president and those who he can work with in Congress to have the authority to be appointing people that they just want to get the results they want for the court to be a rubber stamp? This is very, very dangerous. And fortunately, given the division of Congress right now and his lame duck status, as you were saying, there's no way that this is going through any time between now and his departure from the White House. But the fact is that this is like a trial balloon of trying to see, can we concentrate power? Can we redistribute constitutional power so that those who have the views that we think are progressive and rightly on the right side of history will have the ability to not just pass them, but have them imposed upon the entire country? This is a dangerous institutional proposal. And if anyone believes in constitutional order and individual liberty, this is not a path to be going down.
Yeah, and Kamala Harris has said she endorses his proposal, and so if she were to win, she would undoubtedly want to continue trying to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. And your point about always assume that the person who reaches power is your worst enemy, the person you least would like in there, is really an important one. And I want to digress and address that. Because if you see this phenomenon, especially in the healthcare arena, with respect to the vaccines and the mandates and the lockdowns, and this is one of my real beefs with a lot of the right-wing libertarians in the movement, that throughout the whole COVID controversy, they would, give their speeches and their podcasts and write their articles exclaiming against Fauci and Fauci doing this and Fauci doing that, or state officials imposing lockdowns and so forth. But which was all correct, but the way you could always tell that they were right-wingers was their concluding paragraph of their articles or their speeches or their podcasts. And that is, we need to get our people in those positions of power so that we can do the reverse. We can go out and put all these COVID vaccine prescribers in jail and Guantanamo and punish them severely. So they were really advocating a reign of terror in the opposite direction. And I kept arguing that this is not freedom, and they didn't understand this, that what you really need to do is do what you're saying, Richard, is that you imagine when you establish a Centers for Disease Control or an FDA or state healthcare powers, which are the traditional police powers in the states, you imagine your worst nightmare being appointed to run those things. And then you ask yourself, do you want that agency under that control? And clearly the answer is no, I don't want that. So there's only one real solution, and that's dismantle the agencies. Don't sit there and say, oh, Fauci this and Fauci that. I want to get Robert Kennedy Jr. in charge of the Centers for Disease Control. It's not going to accomplish anything in terms of freedom, because all of a sudden you're going to have all this whole, reign of terror against doctors who prescribe the vaccine and people who took the vaccine and whatever. That the only real solution is a separation of healthcare in the state. And we see this in religion. We don't get involved determining who should be in charge of the Department of Religion or the Department of Churches. We don't try to get better people elected to church boards because we don't have church boards. We don't have a Department of Religion. The framers and our ancestors understood this, that you just separate church and state, and then you don't have the problem. And that's why your ultimate solution here, and a lot of the right-wingers could never understand this, is to separate healthcare in the state, at both the state and the federal level, where you just get government out of this area. So I digress there, but I think it's an important point you raise. Let me go back to Roosevelt, though. My big beef with the federal judicial system, Richard, is that while Roosevelt technically lost that court packing scheme, he ended up winning the war because one justice, from all appearances, shifted his vote. That was Owen Roberts. A lot of them were 5-4 decisions, and the four that were called the Four Horsemen: Vandevanner, Butler, Sutherland, and McReynolds. And they were libertarian in terms of economics. They understood, they would declare things like the gold clause cases. They would have ruled in favor of gold clauses when Roosevelt was nationalizing gold. And they declared a lot of the fascist programs like the National Industrial Recovery Administration and Act unconstitutional. But Roberts was on their side. But after the court packing scheme, from all appearances, Roberts says, I'm shifting over to the others. And it became known as the switch in time that saved nine justices as compared to more with the court packing scheme. But after that, the Four Horsemen start retiring. And Roosevelt's got 2 more terms, or all, a term and then a part, where he starts appointing justices. Well, who is he going to appoint, Richard? It's all the statist justices from that point on. And after Roosevelt comes Truman, and then this long succession of statist presidents. So you end up with not only a Supreme Court, but an entire judicial system filled with statist lawyers. And they're lawyers. They get their licenses from the state. To get your license, you have to go to a state-approved law school. You have to go to a state-approved college to get into law school. So they orient the kind of people into this system. Like, it's kind of like a funneling system that believe in all this statism. So what are the chances that a libertarian would ever be nominated to the Supreme Court or confirmed? Virtually nil. So you've got this self-perpetuating statist system, and that's my big beef with the court. The closest that we've ever come to a libertarian-oriented guy was a justice named Douglas Ginsburg, who was on the appellate court, I think the D.C. court, and he got nominated by Reagan, and then they forced him out because they learned that he had smoked marijuana as a young man. So any excuse. So you'll never see a libertarian. There's qualified libertarians to be on the court. I'd say Richard Epstein would qualify. But not only would no president, Republican or Democrat, nominate a guy like Epstein, he couldn't get through the Senate on the ratification.
Neither could Randy Barnett, who's
Randy Barnett, another one. And so now, does that mean that I want to see some kind of tampering with the system? No. As you point out, they established this structure. I think it was well, I have no doubts that it was a structure that was altered with the adoption of the national security state, irreparably altered, because obviously the Supreme Court does not interfere with the fact that they've been holding people in Guantanamo. Zabaya, I think his name is Zabeda. Zabeda, they've held there. Abu Zabeda, they've held for 22 years without a trial. Well, obviously, the speedy trial requirements don't apply to the Pentagon and the CIA and the national security establishment. The trial by jury requirement. But by the same token, I say focus on dismantling the national security state, but don't do what Biden's doing and trying to alter the Supreme Court composition, because ultimately you're really weakening the system in terms of trying to protect what we have left of freedom in this country.
Yeah, part of the thinking, as I understand, for the life membership in the court was to hope that those individuals would then be above politics and factionalism. And there have been instances in which, for political reasons, a particular person has been nominated and then approved by the Senate to join the Supreme Court, where it's expected that he would be a trustworthy conservative or a trustworthy liberal. And then when they've sat on the court for a while, whether originally or now in this position of saying, I'm beyond politics, they can't remove me, maybe I should try to really think about what seems to be constitutionally right, constitutionally wrong. You watch these people take positions that the president they originally nominate them would be aghast at. So that there is a rationale that that person is supposed to, remember I used the word supposed to, be rising above politics and looking at the long run institutional rights and wrongs of following the requirements and the limits of the Constitution. And that would be overthrown. That concept, that principle of what the court you hope will be operating like, that is totally undermined. If you put in these term limits of 18 years, which is what Biden proposed in this op-ed piece he had, what either in the New York Times or the Washington Post a couple of days ago, and and then you would arrange it with the staggering of what once every 2 or 3 years there'd be new appointees. I mean, this basically makes it just another version of the House of Representatives, where your horizon never looks beyond 2 years because you're always running for reelection, which means you never look beyond the expediency of the moment as opposed to the principles of what you should be voting about. And so this has just undermined the institutional importance of the court. Whether it has worked as perfectly as the founding fathers would have hoped, or one imagines that they hoped, I think it is very dangerous to tamper with it.
Yeah, I think your point about lifetime appointment is very good. Is it when now there's that old saying by Lord Acton that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and there's no question that federal judges can be very, very arrogant, abusive people. I'll give you a real life example of this phenomenon. As you know, I practiced law for 12 years as a trial attorney, both in state and federal courts. And you walk into a federal court and you can feel the power. I mean, there's no question. Walking into a federal courtroom is totally different from a state courtroom. You can feel power. And part of that power is the lifetime appointment that a federal judge has. And a lot of justices or judges at the district court level cannot handle the power. Now, by the time you get qualified enough to serve as a Supreme Court justice, you're able to handle power much better, I think. Yeah, that kind of temperament to be able to make it that high. But at the district court level, there's a lot of politics that goes into becoming a federal judge. And my dad was a lawyer too, and he grew up in San Antonio, so he knew a lot of the San Antonio lawyers and judges. And he told me a story of there was a judge named John Wood, federal judge in San Antonio. He was known as Maximum John because in every drug case, he would automatically give the top sentence. You know, he was doing his part to win the war on drugs. This is back in the like 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, where they were going to win the war on drugs. The same thing that the federal judges are doing today. It's fascinating. It's just a mirror image. And so he would just automatically give the top sentence. But one of the guys he had grown up with, and my dad had known him in high school, and another lawyer that practiced law there in San Antonio as a trial lawyer, that Wood called him into his chambers right after being confirmed as a federal judge. And Wood says to this lawyer, he says, Bond, you know that, and we both know that federal judges can become so abusive at times. And I want you to know that if that ever happens with me, I want you to come and tell me because I need to know it. And like I say, they were friends. They'd gone to high school together. And said, Bond says, fine, Judge. Okay. He says that within 1 year, 12 months, Bond walks into the judge's chamber and says, Judge Wood, I'm not going to say anything else, except all I'm going to do is ask you to transfer all of my cases out of your court to another federal judge in this district. That was how bad this guy had gotten in 12 months. Just abusive and nasty. So that's what lifetime appointments can do. So I can see the logic of a term limit by saying, well, but the problem with, there's no perfect system. And with term limits, you start getting politics involved and you see that you're going to be leaving, your 18th year is leaving, you start lobbying for another position somewhere else, and you start trimming your judgments and cases and so forth. So I think the system that they established with lifetime appointments, where there is a sense of independence. You don't have to worry about somebody not electing you in the next election. You can render justice as you see fit. Are there abuses? Of course. But I think by and large, it's a fantastic system as compared to other systems where the judiciary is highly corrupt and purchasable by the litigants.
Yeah, I think that if you just look at many countries around the world, judges are just reflections of the executive who runs the state. Do you think the Supreme Court justices or their version of the Supreme Court justices in Russia are independent of Putin's will, or the kind of court system they have in China relative to what Xi Jinping wants the country and the courts to do? Every authoritarian has the court system, when it involves anything that they consider important, to just mirror his likes and dislikes, which means arbitrary power is served even by the court system.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that you go to Russia and that no court's going to issue a judgment if he thinks Putin doesn't approve of that
Exactly.
particular judgment. He's going to look for guidance as to how he should rule, and it's the same in a lot of other countries. All right, Richard. On that note, we'll wrap things up. As always, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your support of FFF. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.